All right, so this is our agenda for the call. We're gonna start off with talking about field organizing, defining what is it, why does it matter? Then we'll go into a little bit about the different phases of creating a field organizing program. I'll walk you through creating a field plan, all the necessary sections and why that's important. Then at the end, we'll have some time for questions and talk about next steps, how you can apply some of this knowledge. So first section, field organizing, what is it and why does it matter? I definitely want to flip that question on you all and, see if you have any thoughts off the bat before we give an official definition. Again, you can feel free to use the chat if, just some buzzwords. What comes to your mind when you hear field organizing? All right, yeah. I mean, I would agree with all of this. Definitely, GOTV, we'll talk a little bit about that, relational community organizing, boots on the ground, door knockers, all of that, part of the field plan, part of the field organizing program. Those are definitely components of it. And, so I want to kind of sum it up definition wise, and some of the main goals. So in general, field organizing is the process, it's a program we put together to directly contact voters. Is really important, the direct contact aspect, in order to educate them, impart information, and then also to mobilize voters or your community towards specific campaign goals, whatever those might be, right? Sometimes field organizing is called grassroots organizing or, simply just voter contact. So whenever you hear those words, you should always think about field organizing, contacting voters. And the main goals of field organizing, again, is to contact your voters directly, which, we'll talk about why directly reaching voters as opposed to an indirect method is effective. One of the other goals is to identify your supporters, versus opponents and people who might be undecided. And then finally, to turn them out to vote for you, right? All of those are three necessary components of a field organizing plan. So why is field organizing important? So as you all probably know and already come to this training with, to win an election, it means that you have to win the most votes, right? Plain and simple. There's a lot of moving components to a campaign and elections, but to win, your candidate simply needs to have more votes at the end of the day. And, field organizing, the process of directly contacting voters, having those face-to-face, one-on-one direct conversations has been shown to be effective at, number one, cementing, your candidate's name and what they stand for, their brand into people's minds, but also, persuading that voter to actually come out and vote. It takes numerous times of a person hearing about a candidate, hearing about the election day, in most cases, to have that information actually stick with them. And so field organizing is where part of that is going to happen. And field organizing, the field team is not the only part of a campaign. You'll have different areas like communications, fundraising, all of those other components of a campaign are going to be executed and planned in coordination with what the field strategy demands, right? And so when we talk about winning enough votes, we'll talk about in just a moment, how do you know how many votes you need to win, right? That comes from the field plan. That comes from your field team. And so the communications team is going to also be operating in a way that's focused on getting to that win number, right? Fundraising is done all in pursuit of having enough money, having enough resources to get the number of votes you want, right? So field organizing and contacting voters, winning over hearts and mind is really at the heart of all the different moving parts of a campaign. And then finally, actually getting out there, talking to voters, hearing from them what they're thinking, what the issues they care about are, that is going to be the best feedback loop that you can get about how your campaign is actually connecting with the voters that you're trying to win over and turn out. So there's a lot of reasons why field organizing is important. So next, we'll talk about the different phases of a field organizing program. You don't just start a campaign a year out and then election day comes, and you do that in a way that isn't thoughtful, right? Like there has to be succinct parts of a plan and a program. And so the three key phases, the traditional phases of a organizing program, are going to be ID, persuasion, and GOTV. And so, right off the bat, I want to say that this is kind of a template, right? And not one case fits all. You're going to find oftentimes that, some of these phases overlap, right? Especially if you're running on a much shorter timeline. Usually it's recommended that a campaign is starting anywhere from a year and a half out, but it's usually most likely that you might be running your campaign within a year, within 6 months. And so sometimes you might find that these phases overlap. So the first phase is typically known as ID. And ID stands for identifying, right? And so your goal here during this first phase of your campaign, usually the first 2 or 3 months, depending on your timeline, is to go out there and be able to identify your supporters, identify opponents, people who support a candidate who you might be running against. And then also you want to be able to identify who are the undecided voters, right? Where in the electorate, in the communities of voters that we're trying to reach, are there folks who we can still persuade and change their minds? So that's what this first phase is all about. Some other things in terms that you might figure out when you're trying to identify supporters is a little bit about your candidate's name recognition, right? Are they well known when you're calling around in the community? Do people know candidate Joe Schmo, or is that name completely unheard of? And you can also kind of get a feeling of, or a sense of, what issues the community cares about, right? You can also identify issues, right? So you can see, do folks care about healthcare here? Do they care about jobs here, right? Or what are the issues that are really making voters talk here? And so that's important information to have in the first phase of your campaign and early at the top, because that's going to kind of inform your message, right? In your candidate's platform, or at least it should. And that leads us into the next phase, the second phase, which is persuasion. And that's all about actually doing the work to convince voters that your candidate is the best choice, right? And so that can look like a number of things, but really this is where you're going to see volunteers out there in the community, knocking on doors, making calls, sending texts, whatever it is, to explain the merits of your candidate over another choice, right? And to really talk about the issues. This is where your candidate is going to get the chance to really make their brand known. And then, once you've been able to, in this phase of the campaign persuasion, either convince folks to support your candidate, especially the undecideds, or some of, folks who right off the bat are supporting your opponent, this leads us into GOTV. And, somebody mentioned GOTV in the chat as something you think about when you hear field organizing. GOTV stands for Get Out the Vote. And, again, this is a whole phase, a whole part of your organizing program, and we could do an entire training just on GOTV. This is just like an introductory training. We're going to touch on the basics. So, I'm not going to get super into what Get Out the Vote is all about today, but at the heart of it, this is the last part of your campaign, your program. All other aspects of your campaign have led up to this moment, and you're really focused on getting the people who have said, yes, I'll support you, actually out to vote, right? Because it's not enough to win a campaign to get people to say, yes, I like your candidate. You actually have to get them to, show up and cast a ballot or, send in their mail-in ballot. And so that's what that last phase is all about, reminding people who said, yes, I'll support your candidate to actually do it. And, maybe turning out people who are less likely historically to vote. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So now we're going to talk a little bit about creating a field plan, but before I move on, I just want to stop to see if there's any questions on what I've discussed so far. And I see a question in the chat from Ivan. If you don't have the backing of the Democratic heads, how do you get this list on your own? I'm going to save that question for the end, just because I feel like it's slightly separate from what we talked about, but very important. And there are a few ways to try to get a list of voters to reach out to if you don't have the backing of the Democratic Party. We'll talk about that. But are there any other questions related to the phases of a field program or field organizing in general? Is VBM being pushed over getting folks to the actual polling place? I mean, I think, especially in light of like the last 2 or so years with the pandemic, vote by mail, mail-in ballots have definitely gained in popularity. And, there's more ways for voters to vote than ever. We have vote by mail, we have early voting, and then we, of course, have election day voting. So, I wouldn't say that 100% in every case, vote by mail is like the preferred way to vote. But there are a lot of benefits to that, to having, to number one, getting your supporters registered to vote by mail, and then actually getting them to turn a ballot in. And one of the benefits of that is that you can actually basically get a sense of your vote count, how many votes you have in the bank ahead of election day that way, right? Because at least in New Jersey, we're able to go to the state Secretary of State's website, the Division of Elections, and voters can actually track when their ballot has been received, right? And so if you have a really good program where you're identifying who your supporters are, and checking in with them to make sure that their ballot was sent, you can already know, hey, 50% of my supporters have already sent in their mail-in ballots. So we don't have to actually focus on trying to turn them out for early voting or election day voting, right? Because they've already voted. And so it can help you conserve some of your resources later down the line. But it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. It does still take a lot of effort to get those folks signed up and have their ballots sent in. How do you get the undecided, independents, moderates, or any group not rigidly confined to a party to vote for you or your candidate? I think that's a great question. Not a very simple answer to that question. I think it depends, right? In terms of like this persuasion, I think this goes back to this persuasion phase and the ID phase, where you're, number one, like identifying what it is voters in your community actually care about. And then you want to make sure that your campaign's message and the things that your candidate are talking about along the campaign trail are actually tailored towards that. And you're not going to always be able to win over every single voter. I think a campaign also has to make really tough choices about which votes they care about the most, right? And which votes they want to prioritize. And this can go into like a larger discussion of, why is a candidate running? Why, what are the goals of this? Do you have goals outside of, just winning the office? What do you want to do with that power that office brings? And so, you might not always be able to win everybody over, but at the same time, it really depends on the district. It depends on the candidate, right? So I'm sorry I don't have like one super clear answer to that, but we will have trainings in the future that actually focus a little bit more on, navigating these tough conversations, how to have a really effective, persuasive conversation. So, we'll later in the future have a training more focus on that, I think. But yeah, that's what I can share for now. Okay, so we're gonna move into this next part, which is actually creating a field plan. So again, I want to turn it back over to you all and ask you a question. Why do you think campaigns need a field plan? Why is that important? And again, feel free to answer in the chat or unmute yourself and share. All right, so I see in the chat to stay organized and on target. Yeah, basically that's it, right? Anything that you do really, if you want to do it well, it needs to be done with a plan. And so, basically successful campaigns, successful organizing programs that can win over voters, that won't just happen by accident, right? You have to be deliberative about it. You have to be intentional with everything you do. And the field plan is going to serve as your roadmap to victory. It should, as much as possible, take you from A to Z. Um, and we'll talk shortly about the different sections, but in general, you want your campaign plan to contain your goals, right? What is it we want to try to achieve? Your strategies, how are we going to achieve those goals? And then timelines, when is this happening? Who's doing what, right? And then benchmarks for measuring your success, right? And that goes back to your goals. How are we going to know that we are being successful in raising those goals? We have to contact 1,000 voters. What are our benchmarks? Are we saying we need to contact 250 in 1 month and another 250 in the next month, right? So you're going to want to have some indicators of how you're doing. And then your field plan is a living document. It should evolve and be updated as the campaign does. It's not going to be something that is written in stone, right? So any good campaign plan is going to be, or field plan is going to be referred to regularly and updated regularly as your campaign evolves, as new challenges present themselves, as new opportunities present themselves. Some of the basic facts that you started off with and you based your campaign plan on might change as the campaign progresses. So it is a living document. And then finally, your field plan has to be written down, right? I know a lot of folks who would be like, yeah, I have it. I know exactly what we're going to do. It's all right here in my head, but that's not good enough, right? It has to, number one, be written down because again, if you're going to be referring back to this plan, you need to know where you started off with. And, again, it's helpful to keep yourself accountable to the goals that you set out, right? If you are just saying, yeah, we're going to do this thing, but you don't have it actually written down concretely, you're less likely to actually be able to keep track of those things and whether you're hitting your goals. And then also, you're not going to be the only person on your field team, right? Or in your campaign in general. There's going to be others. And so it's really important that everyone's on the same page in your campaign team. And so the field director should see the field plan. The campaign manager, some other campaign leaders and key volunteers will probably need to see this field plan. So it's important that it's actually written down somewhere. So some key sections of the field plan, and again, this can vary by campaign, this can vary by how you actually, personal style, what you think is important. But some key things that should be in there is your ballot access plan, key field numbers, your voter targeting, and then a voter contact timeline. Okay. So ballot access. Ballot access is actually all about fulfilling the initial requirements that your candidate needs to get on the ballot. And a lot of times, some of the work that's needed to do this is driven by the field team. And so it's important to have that in your field plan up front. Um, your ballot access efforts are mostly going to consist of actually collecting signatures from petition signatures from voters in your community, right? Just about every office, I can't think of a public office that you can run for, um, will require you to actually get the signatures and basically the endorsement of uh, voters in the district that you're trying to run for. And these requirements, the number of signatures, the number of signatures you actually have to collect, that's going to vary by office, right? So typically, if you're running for, as an example, governor, you might need more signatures to get on the ballot than school board, right? And this information, how many signatures you need to get on the ballot, you can usually find this, either with, Secretary of State, a county clerk, some type of public servant who is responsible for like overseeing elections. And in terms of figuring out that number, again, it varies. Sometimes you might find that it's a flat number. You need to collect 200 signatures. Sometimes you'll find that it's a percentage. Sometimes you need to collect 10% signatures from 10% of the people who turned out in the last regular election, right? And so then you have to do a little bit more research. So that information's out there, but you do have to go find it. So this has to be part of your plan because, how are you actually going to get signatures? There's numbers of ways to do it, but, you're actually going to have to go out there and talk to voters, right? This direct voter contact, that's part of field organizing. So sometimes you might meet people in the park or at, in front of grocery stores. Sometimes you actually go door to door, knocking on folks' door, asking them for their signatures. So there's a number of ways to do it, but usually this is going to be done by your field volunteers early on, right? And then I just wanted to quickly talk about traditional signature collection versus digital. In the last 2 years, especially, you might have seen that there have been, executive orders and laws passed that have allowed signatures to be collected digitally. And so, I think in a lot of cases, this has been a huge boon for accessibility, right? And helping to collect signatures in a way that can be more efficient, right? Because it can be super hard and it takes a lot of time to actually have volunteers stand out there for an hour or 2 hours, however many hours you need to collect all the signatures. And so being able to do that digitally as opposed to having to collect handwritten signatures, you can send someone a link if that's allowed, or to collect their signature. You can share things on social media via email. So especially for the 2020 election, we saw digital signatures be allowed to be collected. We haven't seen that. That's not the case in this election, which is unfortunate. But I just wanted to point that out to you all. So, this is just a sample of what your timeline for signature collection activities could look like, right? So, when you're planning this out, you definitely want to consider, number one, when are signatures actually due to be turned in? Again, this is information you'll find with some election administrator. So you want to include the dates of when you're actually collecting your signatures, where you might be collecting them, and anytime you're setting up a volunteer event or activity to collect signatures, you want to have a goal, right? And it's always going to be my advice to aim higher than the number of signatures actually required. If you need 100, aim for 200, right? Or 150, whatever it is you can collect. Number one, because your signatures usually need to be verified. Again, the requirements are going to vary, but who you're collecting signatures from usually needs to be a voter in your district, right? They might have to be registered with a certain party, things like that. And so if you're just going out there and blindly collecting signatures, kind of cold contacting and not asking folks, then some of your signatures might not be valid. And so it's always better to be safe and collect more than you need. And I also want to point out that you should think of your ballot access and signature collecting activities as an opportunity that blends into your identification phase, right? And potentially even your persuasion phase. So, while you're out there collecting signatures, it can totally be like, hey, we just need 100 signatures to get our person on the ballot. But it can also be an opportunity to tell them about your candidate, right? And start to build those relationships in the community, start to gain that name recognition. So, think of signature collecting as an opportunity as well. So now the next section of your field plan is your actual key field numbers and using those to set goals. So, ultimately, I want to start off by saying the math and the calculations that I'm about to take you through will lead you to being able to know what is your win number. How many votes do we actually need to win this election? But you do need to do a little bit of math to get there. So the first thing you're going to want to figure out and calculate is the projected voter turnout, which is how many people will actually vote in this election, or how many people do we estimate will vote in this election, right? And so step one to doing that is to compare the turnout from the three recent similar elections. And so, you can see here in this template, we have election 1, 2, and 3. All of those will represent a different election year. But when it says recent similar elections here, this is where a field director or field organizer has a lot of kind of room to strategize here, right, and make assumptions. When we say recent similar elections, let's say we're talking about the 2024 presidential election, right? You would assume that the three recent similar elections is 2020, 2016, and 2012. And that very well may be the case, but there are other things you want to take into consideration. Number one, you want to take into consideration what is different in the political context and environment in this election than might have been in those last few elections, right? So was there, a particularly polarizing candidate or a really controversial issue that was driving that election? And because that might have, increased the number of voters who normally turn out, or, we might have seen less voters turn out than normal, right? And then, you also, in terms of similar elections, this is where similarities come into play. It might not make sense to compare the turnout between an off-year election in terms of, off-year of major presidential elections. So, in New Jersey here, we have our gubernatorial races are, typically the year after a big presidential election, right? And so if you're comparing the turnout between 2016 general election and 2017 general election, you might see that they're drastically different in terms of how many people actually showed up. And, that's not necessarily a coincidence, right? There's reasons for that. Voters are usually creatures of habit, and they usually establish voting patterns. So, you might find that lots of people turn out in the big presidential elections, top of the ticket elections, but not as many turn out in a more localized election. And so you just want to make sure that, you're considering all of those factors that might influence how many voters turn out. So to find out, what is the turnout for those elections, you're going to want to, number one, in this first column, you can see, figure out how many votes were cast, and then how many registered voters there were at the time, right? And you can then figure out what the percentage of the voters were that turned out, right? So you're basically just going to divide, let's say we have 100 voters registered at the time and 50 votes were cast, then we know that our turnout for that election was 50%, right? And so you're going to want to identify 3 elections that you and your team think are recent and similar, and calculate the turnout for those 3 elections. And also sometimes a lot of this information is posted online, so it won't be, you might not even have to do the math. You might be able to just say, okay, turnout for this election was 27%, right? Because it's already been calculated and determined. The next thing you're going to want to do is, in terms of figuring out how many people are expected to vote in this election, the election that your candidate is running in, is to then average the turnout, or find the average turnout, right? Like, what is the average number of voters who turn out in elections that are similar to this one? And all you're going to do is take the turnout that you just calculated from those three elections and find the average, right? So you're going to add them up and divide by those three. And then I also want to take a moment to say that it can be helpful. It might give you a better picture to go even further back than just the last three elections, right? You can certainly get a better picture in some cases of how the voters in your district behave and how they turn out if you consider the last four elections or last five elections. But again, you want to be careful that you're not going so far back that the district lines are changed, right? Like, if redistricting happened and the voters who turned out in 2010 are not going to be the same voters who turned out in 2017, as an example. Okay, and then step 3 in terms of figuring this out is that you're going to, once you have your average turnout, you're going to multiply that by the current number of registered voters, right? So if we have 1,000 voters currently registered, and we've calculated that the average turnout in the past 3 recent elections is 50%, and we multiply that, then we're going to find that our projected voter turnout is 500, right? So that's the first step. You've now found your projected voter turnout, how many people we estimate will turn out in this election. Some things to note is that, again, primary voters and general election voters, they might behave differently. So, when you're selecting your elections to compare, that's another thing. Primary elections, at least in our state, usually see lower turnout than our general election. So it might not help to compare those two elections. You might want to stick with general, you might want to stick with comparing primary. And then one of the resources that I'll be sharing with you all in the follow-up email is a win number calculator. So, I'm taking you through, the nitty gritty of the math right here, but there's actually a tool where you can, just type in some of these numbers and will do the calculations for you. You might have heard of Wellstone. They're a great organization. They've done a lot of training programs. And so they have this great tool, and I'll be sharing that with you all, and you'll be able to use it and see how this math actually works out. So now that you've projected how many voters will turn out in this election, now you need to know how many of those votes do we need to win. So, if we, like we said, if we're projecting that 500 people are going to turn out, what we're going to do to figure out how many votes we need to win is to multiply that by 50%, right? Just cut that in half, because, and then you're going to want to add 1 to that number, because all you ever need to win is a simple majority, right? You need 51% or 50 voters plus 1 to set you over, because 50% alone would just tie you. You need to win, right? So you need at least 1 more voter. So, if our projected voter turnout is 500, we multiply that by 50%, we're at 250. We're going to add 1 voter, and our estimated win number is 251 votes, right? Now, we normally want to be safe than sorry, right? So again, when we're doing our projections of how many people are going to turn out, we might estimate too low, we might estimate too high, or whatever the case is. So we always want to give ourselves some wiggle room and try to aim to win more votes than what we think we'll actually need, just because there's a lot of variables in an election, right? Anything can change, and so always best to aim a little higher, be safe than sorry. And so that number is going to be called your vote goal. We know what it's going to take to win, but our actual goal is going to be set a little bit higher. And so instead of multiplying by the 50% here, we're going to multiply by 52%. And that's going to say, we're, instead of aiming to win 50% of the voters that turn out, let's aim to win 52% of them. And this number is not set in stone. If your campaign feels you need to aim higher, you want to aim for 53%, 54%, whatever it is, you can totally do that. But it is important to establish a goal that's a little higher than the minimum number of votes you need to win. So there are some formulas that you can use to calculate how many votes you need to win in races that have more than just two candidates, right? Because in a two candidate race, this is where you really only need to win 50% of this is where you need to win 50% of the vote, right? You need to win a majority. But if let's say there are four candidates in the race, right? You might not need to win the full 50%. You might need to win 40%. And, let's say the other three candidates, if they split the 60% between them, and, let's say three of the candidates win 20%, 20%, 20%, your candidate can still win 40% and win, right? And so the math that we do to figure out our win number and our vote goal, that can change a little bit based off of how many candidates are in the race. And so there are these standard formulas you can use. You can see, excuse me, if we're at 5 to 9 candidates, we're going to take our estimated our projected voter turnout number, and where Y equals the number of candidates. Let's say we have 5 candidates, you're going to divide that by 2, or if it's 7 minus the 3 in the parentheses, you're going to divide your projected voter turnout by 4. And so that will be your new vote goal, as opposed to doing it where you're only calculating to win 50% or more, right? So now we'll go into voter targeting, right? So we figured out how many people are actually going to turn out in this election. And we figured out how many votes we need to win, and how many votes we're actually going to aim for. Now we need to figure out which of these voters are we actually going to try to reach to turn out to vote for us. So a question for you all again: why should we target voters? Why is it important that we target voters as opposed to reaching out to everyone? You can share in the chat, or excuse me, take yourself off mute. Oh, just saw your question, Joe. Is there a formula for a race when multiple candidates can win, like for assembly or county commissioner? Those formulas do exist, and I don't have them here up on the screen, but I can share those. And for those of you who are asking, basically, what Joe's saying is, for example, in New Jersey, our legislative district races, 2 candidates can win, right? There's 2 assembly seats, and so the number of votes you need to calculate, or your calculations that you make, will probably be different if 2 people can win as opposed to just the 1. So there are formulas for that, and I can share later. All right, so some answers here. The same reasons stores advertise their businesses, to appeal to them for support. Totally. You want to spend you want to not spend your valuable money to target anyone and everyone. 100%. So yeah, you all are exactly right in terms of why we should target voters. And the simple answer is resources are limited, right? Across the campaign, and every single team, every single department, unless you're like working on a Bloomberg campaign where there's unlimited resources. Most campaigns are going to have limited resources, both in terms of your people that you can rely on, right? Volunteers to help, the money that you have to spend on, resources and materials, and then also your time, right? You don't have forever usually to reach voters. You're usually, working on a limited amount of time, whether it's a year, a few months, whatever it is, you don't have forever. And so reality is we cannot reach everyone. We're not going to have the people to be able to reach everyone. Most of the time, you might not have the money you need, and you're certainly not going to have the time. And so we have to make sure that we are directing all of these resources in places that they are going to be the most effective and have the most impact on our voters. So there's really three traditional ways to target voters. Number one is going to be by voter history, which elections do they typically turn out for. The next is going to be geographically, right? Where do they actually live? Where in the district? Are they in a strong Democratic like stronghold? Or are there a lot of Democrats there, or are there not? Is it an urban area? Is it a rural area, suburban? All of these things will matter in terms of how you're able to reach voters. So you want to consider their geography, where they're at, and then demographically, right? Um, that can include things like age, gender, race, religion, all different types of characteristics. So number one, want to talk about targeting by voter history. So, like I said before, people and voters, they are creatures of habit. And so usually we'll be able to, reasonably estimate whether someone expects to vote in a certain election, right? A lot of times what you'll hear campaigns do is, they'll target folks based off of how many times they've turned out in the last 4 recent elections. So you might hear people say, oh yeah, they're, a 3 out of 4 or 2 out of 4 voter. And so, what we have here is basically a chart, and I'll show you what this looks like filled out with some more information in a moment. But you can see on this one axis we have here is voting history, right? So we're looking at people, do they always vote? Do they sometimes vote, or do they never vote? And then something you'd also want to include in that is, not only their likelihood to turn out to vote, but, where they rank in terms of being a supporter for you. How likely are they to vote for your candidate? Not only how likely they are to turn out to vote, because that will matter too. And so just a little information on what you see here, the supporter ID. Oftentimes you'll hear campaigns identify voters and how supportive they are of a candidate on a 1 to 5 point scale, right? Number one being the strongest supporter, this is someone who 100% super amped up for your candidate. You can definitely rely on them to turn out to vote for you. And then on the opposite end of that spectrum, we have someone who's a strong opponent or strong supporter of your opponent. And so we'll call those people fives, right? And this is important because how, we categorize voters based off of their supporter ID is going to inform us on how we treat those voters in terms of our organizing program. So here is a little bit of this chart filled out with some examples. So, let's start in this first box up here at the left, which is, always votes and is a strong supporter. These are our ones. Again, I want to make clear that these are examples. Again, every campaign is going to make their own decisions on how they categorize voters and how they treat them. But for an example, folks who always vote and folks who are strong supporters are number one. We're going to call those people our base voters, right? So we want to be able to identify them early, and we are likely going to want to recruit them into core campaign roles, either make them volunteers or get them reaching out to their own networks to be donors, to be volunteers. Somebody mentioned relational organizing. These base voters are great people to be part of your relational organizing program, right? If they're already 100% going to vote for you, they're strong supporters of you, they're the best people to kind of be your messengers and reach out to their own family and friends who live in the district and, get them to support you as well. And then let's go on the opposite end of that spectrum, which is this last box all the way in the bottom right, which, it would be someone who never votes, has no voter history, but has also said they're a strong opponent, right? Like they support your candidate's opponent, and we rank them a 5. We're gonna call these folks or categorize them as no vote history, opposition. And so really, again, we need to conserve our resources. So we can't spend all of our time talking to someone who is never ever going to change for our candidate and who has no likelihood to turn out to vote. So you're going to want to, categorize them and treat them as being no contact. You're really not going to waste much time on them. And then let's go to the middle, right? This middle box here, which is someone who sometimes votes and they might be supporters, right? So they're somewhere in the middle. They might lean supporter, they might be a little undecided for us. And so we're going to categorize them as being sporadic in their turnout, right? Because they sometimes vote. We don't know. Maybe they voted in 2 out of the 4 recent elections, but we're not really sure if they always turn out to vote. And then we know that we're going to have to spend some time persuading them, right? That's why they're in this persuasion category. So what does it say here? We want to try to understand what are the issues and the priorities that they care about, right? Probably the best way for us to spend time talking to them is phone banking, canvassing them, all of those types of things. We're going to want to do research on them because, again, if these are the folks who can go either way, we really want to understand where they're coming from and, what is it going to take for us to win them over. So yeah, I hope this gives you kind of a good understanding of how to group voters and target them based off of some information you might have on their history of voting. And, if you've had enough time in this first phase of your campaign, which is identifying them, you might have been able to identify if they're a supporter, if they're undecided. The next thing is targeting voters geographically. So, where do they live? Like I mentioned already, some of the ways you might want to look at this is, do they live in an urban area? Do they live in a suburban area? Do they live in a rural area? And, a lot of times we are going to make assumptions on how a voter will behave or the issues they support based off of, all of these things that we're considering, right? Like the vote history, but geography, right? Who lives in urban areas? What issues do they care about? Are they the types of voters who will be receptive to our message? Other things to consider is like for each of these precincts, and a precinct is, basically just a specific district. A precinct is like the smallest unit a voting district can be. But speaking in terms of districts in general, whether it's a state legislative voting district, a city, a ward, you want to consider the number of voters who are registered in that area, right? What party they belong to. Are there a lot of Democrats here? Are there a lot of unaffiliated voters? And you want to look at, previously how many voters have turned out in those areas. And then, of course, when you do your calculations, for your win number and your projected voter turnout, you might be doing that on, let's say you're running for governor, you might do one big calculation for how many voters are expected to turn out in the entire state, but you can also do those calculations for how many voters are expected to turn out in this specific county, this specific town. And so you also want to take those projected numbers and that expected vote turnout into consideration when you're doing your targeting. All right, so next is targeting by demographic. So I've said this already, but certain groups, they tend to consistently either support progressive candidates and ideas, or in general, democratic candidates, right, and policies that the party typically supports. And some of that overlaps with demographics such as age, right? In general, and we always want to rely on data and not make wholesale assumptions, but in general, we can say that younger voters, right, let's say 18 to 25, they might be more receptive to a certain message than, let's say, voters who are 45 to 60, as an example. And so that might be something you want to take into consideration, right? Again, in terms of who your candidate can appeal to, is there a specific racial or ethnic community who would be interested and be more receptive to your message, right? Consider things like income, gender, religion. So many demographic characteristics that you can consider, but that is one way to target your voters, right? So, taking all of those three things together, we might say, in terms of voting history, we want to target voters who, are high turnout voters or low turnout voters. Let's say low turnout voters, they vote in 1 out of 4 every elections, and they live in the second ward of the city, and they're young and they're Black. Those are the voters we want to target, right? So that's an example of how you can take all of those things and put them together. And so the next phase, so the next section of your plan will be the voter contact timeline. How will you reach your target voters and when? Now you've figured out how many votes you need to win, how many voters you need to win. You figured out who you want to target. Now you need to figure out when you're going to do it and how. So a question for you all is, what kinds of strategies can we use to reach voters? So yeah, if there's any ideas you have, please share them in the chat. All right, yeah, great examples here. Meet and greets, door to door with door hangers, fundraisers, mailers, phone banking, text banking, door to door contact. You all are on it. Advertisement events at county fairs. Yeah, definitely getting out of there. You guys basically hit all of the ones that I listed here, and this is not an exhaustive list either, right? Especially in this day and age, there's more ways to reach voters than ever. We can be super innovative and creative, but these are some of the big traditional ways that campaigns are using now, which is, canvassing door to door, actually knocking on people's door. But then there's also just kind of like general neighborhood community canvassing, right? Like you could meet people in parks and talk to them, somebody mentioned going to county fairs and other events like that. Then there's phone banking, which is actually like picking up the phone, calling a list of voters, text banking, texting them, direct mail, sending mail to people's homes, rallies, campaign events. Somebody mentioned fundraisers and meet and greets. Setting up your own campaign events is certainly a way to do it. And then visibility, which, that's kind of, advertisement signs, lawn signs and yard signs, things like that, ads, billboards. Those are contact methods. But, not every contact method is treated equally, right? So some of them are more effective than others. There's pros and cons to using them. So some things to consider is, financial costs. Again, resources are always limited. So, you need to consider how much money will be required. Something like TV ads may cost a lot more money than, text banking might, right? So how much money do you have? How much money can you afford to dedicate towards this? Next thing, how many volunteers will actually be needed to help you carry out this strategy? That's another limited resource. Time and planning, how much time will be needed to plan and execute the activity? And then also on that note is like, when is the best time to use a strategy, right? If it might not make sense to, run ads a year ahead of the election, but it might make more sense to do that, a month out. So you also want to consider the timing. And then in terms of impact, how hot or cold is the activity for the voters that your campaign is trying to reach? What will be the impact? And when we say hot or cold, it's like, I think, yard signs is a great example of a cold activity in terms of, there's not really much human connection going on there, right? Like you're not going to get two-way conversation and feedback. And so it might not be as impactful in terms of convincing the voter as opposed to something like door-to-door canvassing, where you're having a face-to-face conversation with someone. And then efficiency, right? How many voters can the activity actually reach at one time? You might be able to reach a whole lot more people by, running ads or by phone banking than you might be able to do with canvassing, just because it takes more time, you need more people to do it. So how efficient is it? And here is just kind of like a an overview of 1 to 5 scale how effective some of these activities are. So 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. So in terms of canvassing as a method, the financial cost of that, it can be pretty cheap, right? All depends on how you do this. If you're using volunteers, if you're paying organizers, but it can be cheap. Printing out door hangers and all of that can be relatively inexpensive when you compare it to some other campaign costs. But in terms of volunteer capacity and how much energy that's going to require from your volunteers, this is like a 5, right? Like canvassing is the thing that takes the most time, the most energy, but it also is probably one of the most effective things that's going to have a huge impact on your voters, having that face-to-face conversation, as opposed to let's say we go down to posters. Just seeing a poster on a telephone pole might not have as much of an impact, and it might that you're not really having a conversation with a voter that will stick with you. But going back up to canvassing in terms of efficiency, again, it is the most impactful thing, but it takes time to actually knock on doors and have conversations, right? You might be there talking to a voter for 10, 15 minutes, whereas a poster, you're not spending much time at all, as opposed to how long it took you to put those up, right? So, just some things to consider when you're deciding which contact strategies to use to reach your voters. And then, there are contact formulas for some of these major strategies, right? So you can actually reasonably calculate or estimate how long it will take you to, knock X amount of doors, how many volunteers will be required to knock X amount of doors. So these are just, some assumptions, and we have a resource which I'll be sharing with you all after this, with some of these formulas, not just for canvassing, but also for phone banking. There's also different types of canvassing and phone banking, which we won't get into too much in this training. So for door-to-door canvassing, assuming every door is knocked, or you're knocking doors in a place that's very dense, where there's a lot more homes, so or doors to reach. So consider an urban neighborhood, right? A city. That's a lot more dense than a suburban neighborhood. And so, in terms of how far the doors are apart, right? Like how long it actually takes your volunteers to walk door to door, we the average number of doors that can be knocked per hour is usually about 25. But then when you factor in, once you knock on the door, how many people actually answer and how many, people you can have a conversation with per hour, you're actually going to find that you're usually going to make somewhere around 6 contacts per hour, right? And so when you're putting together your timeline of, hey, this is when we're doing our field organizing, this is when we're doing our canvassing, you have to take all of that into consideration. But then on the, you can see for the example B, if the walk list is, more suburban or a place with less density, you're actually going to probably average knocking on less doors per hour, right? Because, the homes might be further apart. It just takes longer. There's other things to consider, like, are there big hills? Are there lots of stairs? Are there, huge apartment buildings? All of these things can take into consideration when you're doing your calculations for how long it takes to knock a door. So this is just an example of that math put into action. So, assume that you're asked to, you're a field director and you're asked to knock 3,600 households, in a dense area. Not every house in that area will be knocked, but it is dense. And so you want to figure out, one, how many volunteers you're going to need to knock it in, let's say, 10 days. And so the answer to that, which the math is below, is, first off, you're going to start off with, your 3,600 households and figure out how many hours it'll take. So if you have 3,600 households and 24 doors can be knocked per hour, we're just going to divide that, and we get that it will take us about 144 hours to knock all of those 3,600 doors if we hit about 25 doors per hour. Then we're going to want to calculate how many volunteers we're going to need to do that. And something we have to take into consideration is how long is that volunteer shift actually, right? Like how long are we asking our volunteers to go out there and knock doors? Are we asking them to do it for 2 hours? Are we asking them to do it for 3 hours? Are we asking them to do it for 4? So you have to determine that first. And then, once you've already found out that it's going to take you 144 hours, you divide that by, let's say, 3-hour shifts. And then you know that it's going to take you 48 3-hour shifts, or basically you're going to need 48 volunteers who will knock doors in 3-hour shifts. Okay. And so then once you figure that out, and that it's going to take you 48 shifts, and you know already that you only have 10 days to do this, then you can figure out that if you divide that 48 shifts over 10 days, it's going to take you 4.8 volunteers per day. But of course, people don't come in fractions, so let's just round that out, right? It's going to take us about 5 volunteers per day in 3-hour shifts. And then, you can calculate you've just figured out, how many hours we need to put in, how many volunteers, we need per day. You can also calculate how many contacts you're actually going to make, right? So 144 hours, you assume that if you're knocking 25 doors per hour, that you're actually going to make contact with about 6 of those people. Then you get to 864 contacts over those 10 days, knocking on 3,600 doors. Okay. And then this is just a sample contact timeline. You might have made timelines and plans in other areas, so it'll look differently for everyone. But some of the things that you want to have lined up in your contact timeline is, of course, what method are you using to contact voters, right? How many voters are you trying to reach with that specific method? When is this going to be happening, right? So if we're doing door to door as an example, maybe this is happening on the weekends in May. Where are we doing this? We're going to be reaching voters at their homes, and then we can figure out what the cost is going to be. If we're saying we're going to reach 3,000 voters and we're doing door to door, we can figure out how many door hangers we would need and how much that would cost. If you're paying volunteers, there might be other volunteer costs, such as like name tags, pens, snacks, all these types of things that go into planning events, which we will have another training that delves a little deeper. And then you've just figured out, the calculations, how to do the calculations and the math for how many volunteers you'll actually need to complete that. And of course, you want to chart this on a timeline that takes you kind of from beginning to end, depending how much time you have. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information, but we're gonna stop for questions now, based off of what we just went over. I know there's some questions about things that are a little out of this introductory training, so feel free to ask them, and I'll do my best to answer them. But I'm just gonna quickly, let me start with the chat, what's in here now. So have you found out what is a prime time to go out and knock on doors? I feel GOTVing after it gets dark doesn't work too well. Yeah, that's a great question, Ivan, and a great point. It depends, right? Number one, how you're reaching out to people. You talked about knocking on doors. I would say it depends a lot on who is the voter you're reaching out to. If you're reaching out to someone who's like a young person, maybe prime working age, then they might not be home between the hours of 9 to 5. But that's also maybe not be true in like our COVID world that we're living in now, where we've seen like an uptick in like how many people are working from home. So it really depends. You might find seniors at home during these prime working hours, but maybe not. So it depends. Generally though, weekends are a good time to reach people. Sometimes early, like late morning, early afternoon, I found works good between 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. Usually a good time to find people. Um, it depends on the day of the week. You want to be mindful of like their major holidays, major events, things like that. And then, I know you're specifically talking about knocking on doors, but phone banking is another great example. Um, when we talk about phone banking specifically, usually there are programs you can use, dialers, but you can put kind of boundaries on when you should call people, right? You don't really want to call people before 8 a.m. Certainly don't want to be calling people after 8 p.m. Number one, you might just be annoying them and that might be less effective overall. So it really depends. But yeah, GeoTVing after dark usually doesn't work too well just because folks don't want to be bothered at certain times. You always run into that risk. Let's see, other questions that were in the chat. All right, how much time would you say you should spend to register new voters? So that's a really good question. I kind of focused on basics of putting together a field plan here and targeting. But there is 100% a world in which you focus on actually expanding the electorate, right? Increasing the number of people who are registered to vote, and I think again in terms of like looking at signature collection as an opportunity to make connections in the community and start spreading the word. Voter registration is a great opportunity to do that as well, right? Not only are you going to be out there trying to increase the number of voters, but it's a chance for you to talk about your candidate and talk about the issues with folks. You might encounter people who are like, I don't want to vote, why is voting important? I don't want to register. And so if you use it as an opportunity to talk about the issues, you might be more likely. In terms of how much time I would say to spend, it depends on your campaign and your campaign's priorities, right? And do you need to spend time registering voters? Is that important to you and your message? I generally, I think it's important to spend time increasing the electorate, bringing in new people who typically are not already participating. What days in the week are best to do GeoTV? I mean, typically when it's GeoTV, this last, let's say 2 weeks of an election, folks are doing things every day of the week, right? So you might see phone banking, maybe Monday through Friday, and then knocking on doors on the weekend. So really every day of the week, but you have to be mindful of, again, the times that folks will be available, and it depends who you're targeting, right? um, and when they would be available, when they are likely to answer their phone, when they're likely to be home. Let's see if there's any other questions I might have missed. Okay, Ivan, I see you said you have a printing business and do printing for candidates, and it's not cheap. Use your resources wisely. Yeah, it's definitely not cheap. And it depends where you're printing too, right? The quality of the printing, whether it's a union shop or not, all of these things will come into play. But it all depends. We had the chart where we compared effectiveness, impact, price being one of them. Printing out mailer or door knockers might be cheaper, usually is cheaper than running a TV ad, right? So it definitely has some cost to it. All right, any other questions? All right. Well, obviously, I don't want to keep you any longer than we have to, so I just want to quickly wrap up and talk about next steps. So, like I said, and I talked about a number of resources. The calculator, the win number calculator, the voter contact formulas. There'll be a few other things that I send you in a follow-up email. But in terms of starting to apply your knowledge that you just learned here, I know some of you might already have kind of like a baseline of experience here. And so, number one, if you're looking to actually start supporting candidates in your community and across the state, like I said, PD&J, our mission is to help elect progressive candidates, and we do this a number of different ways. But we do have we establish chapters across the state where we have members. They come together. They identify issues in their community and they organize around those issues. But they also organize and recruit community members to run for local office, right? From, the lowest office up to the very top. And so if you're interested in doing some of that work and meeting other people who are doing that work, I definitely encourage you to consider becoming a member of PD&J. You'll get access to more training and resources like this. We also be part of a community of like-minded folks across the state who are doing this work. And then, if you're interested in continuing to build on this knowledge, honing your skills, I encourage you to register for our second training, which is going to take a deeper dive specifically into phone banking, setting up phone banking programs, writing scripts, training volunteers, all of that. Will dive a little deeper, and this will be part of a series of trainings. So this phone bank training is going to be taking place April 9th at 12 p.m. I'll include the registration link for that in the follow-up. All right. And then that's it. Thank you all so much for your time. You can learn more about PD&J at our website, pdnj.com, and you can reach out to us at our email here too. All right, so thank you all so much. I'll hang around for a few minutes if anybody has questions, but otherwise, enjoy the rest of your weekend. All right, so I'm just gonna read these questions. How do I find candidates I could assist in their campaign? You guys support near me. Let's see, Ryan. The best way to do that, I would encourage you to reach out to us. We're still a relatively new organization. We're pretty young, so we're still setting up shop in a lot of places. We're looking for people to join us. So there are certain places, like Hudson County, where we have really active chapter where we have endorsed candidates to support and you can volunteer. But in other places where we are still looking to, identify great candidates, great community leaders. And so the best way to do that is going to be to just reach out to us. All right, let's see. We can do union and non-union work for candidates, organizations, businesses. We have, yeah, Ivan, I'm pretty sure I'm familiar with your printing shop. Like I volunteered for and I worked for Larry Hamp's campaign in 2020, and I'm pretty sure we ordered some stuff from you all. So I'll give you my email here in the chat, and we can definitely stay in contact. And obviously you have the PD&J email. We definitely have a need for vendors. Whenever our chapters and our state organization endorse candidates, that might be something also just for our own internal needs. So probably not right now, but I can definitely connect you with like our executive director who oversees this. And yeah, I'd love to talk more. And then last question is, what races should a new field organizer first run a race? If you're new to this, it usually helps to come in more of like maybe a volunteer capacity early on, right? To actually go out there, do phone banking, get trained on how to have conversations with voters, canvassing, all of that. But also you might just be like super great and have a lot of those skills locked down early on. Maybe you've done this before, you're looking to step up. I would definitely encourage a local race just because the size of the district, it might be smaller, it might be easier to run a school board race as opposed to a Senate race. But it all depends, because I can certainly say, let's say a city like Newark, running for mayor there might not be easy, or city council there, just because of the sheer size of voters and people you need to reach. So it depends, but usually starting local, starting smaller, those are great ways to build these skills. And those races are races where like you'll actually have really informative conversations with people in your neighborhood, right, in your community. and start to build some of these relationships. So that's my suggestion anyways.
Great presentation. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Ivan. Take care.
You too. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye.